going to improvise and use these slides. So, we've got a slide up here that says an office holiday party without the alcohol. What's that all about? It's actually what Reuters had called LinkedIn, and I think this is pretty apt if you think about the way that the platform has transformed over the last few years, particularly since COVID, and how it's redefined what it means to be a professional. And because of that, again, thinking about the importance of emotion when it comes to the content that we're producing for the LinkedIn feed. But, the state of affairs in B2B marketing leaves a lot to be desired, right? With a lot of the thought leadership that's being produced considered mediocre or worse, and with half of B2B purchase decision makers finding advertising boring, which is, quite a lot of pressure to put on marketers. And with the majority of B2B ads likely to generate no sales, which is crazy considering the amount of effort and investment brands put into their advertising content. And I think part of the reason for this is because for whatever reason, when we think of purchase decision makers, IT decision makers, sometimes we think about them as kind of decision optimizing, rational automatons, rather than the human beings that they are. And we can really start to adopt more of a emotion in our creative strategy. So you can see in these two databases here, so that's from the WARC Effective 100 and the IPA effectiveness databases, that more than half of the entrants actually explicitly leveraged emotion in their creative strategy. So don't just speak to the head, speak to the heart. And it's really important to, of course, build mental availability, and emotion helps us to do that. And that is driving customers or audiences from a state of unawareness to awareness to, of course, brand salience. And right at the top there is that all-important mental availability and share of mind. And so emotion is best practice to achieve just that. In this study that was looked at by our LinkedIn B2B Institute, and they're a think tank at LinkedIn, they compared rational campaigns with emotional campaigns, and as you can see here, the very large business effects, as they call it, such as growth and market share, for example, campaigns that leveraged emotion, they significantly outperformed campaigns that had rational messaging only. And so what we wanted to prove was that on LinkedIn, this phenomenon is also true. So we did a little experiment, and we looked at brands who actually received a higher proportion of what we're calling visceral emotion reactions. So on the platform, you'll know there's a like button and there's other reaction buttons as well. So we looked at specifically the heart, the applause, and then the little care button, and then compared those top emotive brands to the rest of their industry. And what we saw was those top emotive brands, when it came to the tech industry, for example, that they actually received, on average, a 25% higher engagement rate compared to the rest of their industries. We then also looked at this not just in tech, not just in B2B, but in luxury as well, to see, okay, is this true across different verticals? And again, we see here a 28% higher average click-through rate for luxury. So now we're looking a little bit more mid-funnel. And that kind of makes sense, right? So if we think about nurturing our audiences or trying to spread brand awareness, emotion kind of makes sense for that. But actually, even when it comes to acquisition performance, those top emotive brands, they outperformed the rest of their industry by 30% when it came to lead gen form completion rates. And when it comes to follower count, as you can see here, this is like a massive number. So here we looked at the average of all companies on LinkedIn, of which there are millions, and found that those top emotive brands, they had nearly 200 times the follower count. If we just look at tech alone, that's 1.6 times. And, you know, here is a brand that does a really great job of sort of talking about emotion through the funnel. It's Headspace for brands, Headspace for companies. And you can see at the brand level here, they kind of adopt this persona of being a well-being kind of mindfulness guru, and they're asking their followers to take a mindful moment. So this is their kind of more organic branded content they've got here. And then when their audience is sort of in the consideration phase of their journey, then we have messaging that sort of reflects that stage. But again, you can see in terms of the look and feel, the creative style and approach, it still feels very consistently emotive, consistently Headspace, all the way down to conversion. And this is also true across paid and organic, right? So we can see Slack here, and actually whether it's lazy or genius, they've used the same content across their organic and paid. And what we found on LinkedIn is that brands that have a paid and organic strategy can lift conversions by more than 14%, right? And reduce those costs per conversion by 12%. But again, you can see emotion, making it about the audience, really, rather than the brand, right? In the type of tone of voice that makes sense for today's LinkedIn. And so from the experiment we ran, we saw that those top emotive brands, they outperformed their peers. So, you know, being emotive is actually a competitive advantage for brands. And the like button, I think we very easily give that on a post, but actually, you know, a deeper level of engagement is when we know that audiences are more likely to take action. So we want to be optimizing our content for the you know, more visceral emotional reactions, with the top most used reaction after like being the heart, right? I don't know if you remember when you yourself use LinkedIn, but we used to have this little purple curious face guy, look like that. And actually he's been retired and replaced with a humor button, which is really kind of a sign of the times, and you know, it's sort of signifying how things have changed. So if we were to kind of illustrate what the emotional ecosystem of LinkedIn looks like, it would be something like this solar system diagram thing that you see before you. And what we've done here is kind of cluster those emotions into these planets with the moons, right? So when you think about content, don't just think about what format it should be in, what aspect ratio, how long should my video be. Think about the type of emotional reaction that you're wanting to solicit. Is it even something that you can make a KPI, right? So we want to perhaps inspire audiences with some really cool stats and research, and maybe, you know, help them think, oh, this is super impressive, or wow, I didn't know that, you know, and inspire, or maybe create a celebratory moment and share company milestones, or milestones headed towards, you know, things like climate crisis tackling initiatives. But at the heart of LinkedIn, it's all about community and offering support when needed, right? So people are on the platform, they're looking for jobs, they're looking to develop themselves, they're establishing their personal brands, and they're all part of some kind of community or sub-community or group. So what's a way that you can produce content that they can relate to, that connects with them, that represents how they see themselves? And here is kind of an example of a few brands who do that. So, you can create this sense of relatability and community through memes, through local content or localized content, or even by naming your audience and the community and group with which they identify. And again, LinkedIn is all about community and sharing those community first stories and how we've helped. We saw a lot of this during the pandemic with a lot of those sort of hashtag in it together pieces of content and moments being shared. But it could also be celebrating inspiration and things like equality and such. And caring, of course, is sharing on LinkedIn. One of our, I think, topmost hashtags within the less than 1%, I think, most engaged with is around Monday motivation. And you can see these brands here. I mean, it's not the most visually impactful posts, but actually they can still receive higher engagement, again, because they are tapping into that sort of care emotion. And humor, right? Humor is serious business. And in fact, it is an underutilized kind of white space opportunity on LinkedIn, particularly amongst B2B brands, and is really something that pays off if you invest in it. And so just finally, ask yourself what emotion it is that you want to drive. And this ad here is from Ogilvy, and they received loads and loads of hearts and applauses for it. And so one of the most sort of powerful emotions is nostalgia. And it's no wonder it's trending right now and has been for quite some time, because it's like a comfort blanket, if you will, in challenging times. And I would say we're definitely going through, a series of successive global events, and they're causing concern for individuals, for organizations, and leaders on the impact of health, society, economies, with like the mental health crisis, the climate crisis, global conflict. And there's just so many things that cause us to worry. And when we worry about the future, we start to feel nostalgic, right? And we find comfort and respite in the idea of the past, with 93% of people in this survey by YouGov feeling that life was simpler in the past. And when times are tough, what we see is that members on LinkedIn, they want to kind of momentarily escape in a kind of mental time travel, whether that's in the future or in the past, even for a micro moment, with the content that they engage with. And so when we think of nostalgia or futurism topics, they kind of manifest as, yes, topics, themes, visual aesthetic, but what they do and what the feeling is a kind of reassurance of the past. So we're transporting people away from the here, the stressful here and now. And so what we decided to do was another little experiment at LinkedIn, and we looked at certain nostalgic phenomena like Stranger Things, like memes, Christmas, Top Gun, and Star Wars to see if that influenced performance. And indeed it did. So we saw that content that referenced nostalgic popular culture, like Stranger Things, they actually had a higher click-through rate than the benchmark, and even more so than top-performing content. So this was higher than top-performing content in an industry. Star Wars, again, was another phenomenon we looked at. It is a universally loved franchise, and in fact, is particularly popular amongst tech industry audiences, perhaps no surprise there, but resonates with various other industries as well. And when we think of nostalgia, it is, indeed a generational, if not multi-generational love affair. And so, when we produce nostalgic content, think about the formative years of the audience that you're targeting, whether that's boomers, Gen X, millennials, or Gen Z. What eras resonated with them most? So again, in this the YouGov survey, in third place, the most fondly remembered decade, we had the 50s and 2000s, and then the 80s, 70s, and 60s, and apparently the most fondly remembered decade was the 90s. So even though there isn't a universally agreed upon golden era, you can see that the certain eras were thought of more positively, and those that related to our own sort of formative years would resonate most. So with that in mind, let's look at kind of May the 4th, which is a cultural, I suppose, this annual cultural event. And I think it's hashtag May the 4th be with you. So we looked at mentions on the platform and saw that those brands that took part in this event actually had higher click-through rate again than the rest of their industry. And you can see as well the engagements by generation, and again, particularly millennials who would have been very young during when the originals were launched, and of course there's all the new sort of offshoots of Star Wars now. And for those of you who have seen the latest season of Stranger Things, then you would be familiar with Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill. What we saw was that Gen X actually engaged with content that mentions or references the song 1.5 times more than Gen Z. And we see the same thing again with Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick. You can see Gen X here, 29% of Gen X engaged with Top Gun Maverick, followed by millennials at 55%, who would have actually been a single-digit age, which is really quite interesting. So they would have almost a different memory of the original Top Gun. However, it's kind of in their periphery, so that reference still has meaning to them. And so it feels like you had to be there, right, for to have that nostalgic feeling. Well, apparently you don't, because there's another phenomenon called faux-stalgia. And that's that same feeling of yearning for the past without actually having experienced firsthand, a memory or event. And so if we think about the popularity of Stranger Things, and I think up until this week, it was the top most watched series of all time, and you can see the engagements between Gen X and Gen Z here are pretty comparable actually, and I do think faux-stalgia has something to do with that, because obviously Gen Z would not have been around during the 80s where the film is set. And so nostalgia isn't just popular culture, right? It's also those personal memories. And so what brands can do is kind of stoke that fondness and familiarity of their shared history with their audience. Okay, so brands who have, long brand heritage, who have sort of some cultural meaning to the products that they produce. And it's something that, as a brand, if you have that, you can tap into. So we can see here this post from Dr. Martens. This is actually a kind of GIF, and it shows people sort of styling this boot style on its 60-year anniversary. So Dr. Martens did a great job of not making it about themselves. Hey, it's my 60th birthday, but actually the way that the audience wears it and expresses their individuality. And then Microsoft here, remind us of a time when we actually had to be told when we could shut down our computers or lose everything we worked on in that session. And nostalgia is also a seasonal thing, with a lot of brands aligning themselves to Christmas as well as other cultural events in the year, such as Ramadan or New Year's, to kind of stoke nostalgia, right? And you can see here that 97% of people, at least occasionally, feel more fondly at certain times of year. And so I'm sure most of you have seen the Christmas ads last Christmas, and actually the John Lewis ad has over 1 million views on LinkedIn. And it's not just the Christmas ads in the UK, but actually across EMEA and LATAM, we see a similar trend. And so, we know that what makes the heart tick makes the user click. So emotion influences purchase decisions, and nostalgia is a particularly potent, particularly powerful emotion. And if we think about where it sits on that emotional ecosystem that I shared earlier, then nostalgia is really about evoking joy, connectedness, relatability, and again, representation, like creating a cohort out of a community. And if we look at the Google example at the bottom, I think that's a celebration of the Google Doodle, which is 22 years old apparently. And really that just makes me think, so it's been more than 23 years since I used Alta Vista, and and how Google has changed in the last 2 decades to be more than just a search engine. So as you can see, it really is about the journey and not the destination. If you remember, not that long ago, there was a how it started, how it's going meme, and we can see, a lot of influencers and individuals kind of taking part in that, also on LinkedIn, but it's also something that brands are able to do. So like Emirates here, and this is an image of Dubai Airport 60 years ago compared to what it looks like today. And again, we can see their growth sort of journey and their expansion, or Lego, who, like Dr. Martens, have made it about their users. And I think if you remember the first Lego set that you ever had, and they were these massive kind of blocks, and nowadays the most intricate structural masterpieces are being created. And so for brands, they can really kind of remind about their brand heritage, their legacy of innovation through storytelling. Qantas is a national icon in Australia. Volkswagen, so the Combi van is a cult classic. And then you've got GE and BMW here, who do have that legacy of innovation through the decades. You can also use your own original IP if you're a brand like Microsoft or a brand like Red Bull, and that is things like products that you own, but it's also mascots, characters, styles, sounds, or moments. It's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. And so I mentioned earlier that nostalgia, it's not just in the themes and the topics, but as well the aesthetic of the creatives we see on the platform. And for all the designers in the room, we know that color is one of the most important aspects of design. And what we saw was those brands that do have a fondness for nostalgia, when they do use nostalgic colors, they tend to outperform, right? So those posts of theirs, when they use nostalgic colors compared to other posts, they tend to perform higher. When it comes to design as well, kind of throwing it back to different eras, like this Gucci example here, using vintage colors or using retro typography, or even just remixing and rehashing the different areas together into sort of one that works as well. And of course, retro video game inspired, right, visuals and CGI graphics. And so for those of you who played the Atari or the NES, you've got this kind of pixel art looking sort of visuals. There are some companies, they outright reference games, so this GWI example here, and they're sort of homage to Pac-Man or Siemens with Mario, or just the look and feel, and it's a kind of purely cosmetic thing, and yet it still works really well. And, you know, when we were in school, right, there, for some of us, myself in particular, scribbled in the side of notebooks, you know, little doodles, little drawings. And so there's that kind of the hand-drawn analog feeling. Again, in creatives, kind of, it kind of evokes that sense of wholesomeness. And digital collage, which I'm sure you've seen quite a bit. We see this used across all industries, and that's that kind of scrapbooking or layering effect that you'll see. And it, again, gives that sort of handmade analog feel, or that arts and craft feel. And finally, the film effect, or a film type of treatment. So whether that's kind of an ISO grain, that's you know, filter that's placed on the imagery, or Polaroid style, you know, something that more tangible, or this kind of 35mm sort of film look. And so it's time for you to get your groove on. It's all about creating a community from a cohort with shared nostalgic phenomena that is topical and timely. Right? Leverage your own IP and cultural codes that are uniquely, distinctively associated with your brand heritage, brand innovation, your brand story. Design your creatives to elicit that, you know, those nostalgic feelings of joy, of connectedness, of relatability, of pride, of representation. Experiment with these various nostalgic and nostalgic aesthetics that I shared, you know, that of course aren't too much of a departure from what makes your brand unique, so your brand visual identity, and of course have fun in the process, right? Appeal to your audience's formative years, but at the same time you can remix and recontextualize past cultural codes to appeal to a new generation. And finally, throw it back on Thursdays, or really any day of the week, with those personal memories and those shared experiences of your brand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wensy.